An interesting week since last week, exactly a week ago, just a day after last week's general election, we saw that the South African currency plummeted by 2.1% against the US dollar. Experts say the rand was clearly reacting to the uncertainty around South Africa's political future as it became clearer that the governing ANC would need to go into coalitions with other political parties after failing to gain a majority. So why should you and I as consumers care about how the rand is performing? To answer that, we are joined by Matete Tulare, the head of foreign exchange at Rand Merchant Bank. Matete, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. The rand was among the world's worst performing currencies yesterday, depreciating further against major currencies by 1.19% and almost touched and came within a whisker of that 19 rand to the US dollar mark that is psychologically quite important. Why should, however, consumers at home concern themselves about how our currency is performing right now, or any given day rather?
Good afternoon, Kolane. I suppose, look, it's been quite an interesting time for the rand, especially over the past week. We have seen ourselves, prior to the election last week at 1830, and then immediately after the elections over the past week, we've seen ourselves actually just earlier this afternoon touching that 19 level. Obviously, there's quite a lot of uncertainty. There's going to be a lot of volatility. At this point in time, we're really playing a headline tennis. Now, I think at this point in time, we're moving from one headline to the next. And obviously, the markets are really on the edge and obviously trying to digest anything and everything that gets said, whether it's a headline about a government of national unity or some sort of coalition or a supply and agreement coalition between the ruling party and also other political parties. And that is obviously very interesting because it really does factor through into the inflation basket. But I mean, if you think about it, just yesterday morning, we did see ourselves as consumers getting that R1 decrease in petrol prices. I mean, that is really going to at least alleviate and help the consumer a lot. And at this point in time, also what's quite interesting is the fact that the oil price is also below $80 a barrel, despite the OPEC announcement last weekend saying that they are still going to rally up the supply cuts. And obviously at this point in time, we have seen Brent around that $77 a barrel. That is very interesting because also remember that Lesetja Kganyago and team at the Reserve Bank, they are watching all these movements in terms of what happens from an inflation perspective. I mean, there's a lot of talk about whether we're going to be cutting rates anytime soon. But like the governor has said, he needs to see inflation at that midpoint of around 4.5% before he can start moving forward and talking about interest rate cuts. But we're not alone in the political sphere. I mean, if you think about the likes of India, Mexico, they've also been in the whirlwind, especially from an emerging market perspective. I mean, India also, the ruling party, they're not getting a sufficient majority, similar like the ANC. In Mexico, also similar issues. So we're not the only country that is facing, a plethora of risks, especially with regards to political uncertainty, even our counterparts in the rest of the world. But at this point in time for the rand, yes, you are right. It's going to be quite interesting to see what happens over the next, call it 10 days before, we get an announcement of what happens from a political front, especially given the fact that that will filter through into whether we see a bit of rand strength or rand weakness.
Matete, it's quite clear that in our everyday lives, the strength of the rand is quite important in everything we do. We are net importers of fuel, we are net importers of wheat and many things that are used in our goods, foods and services. But we've seen investor optimism capitulating on this speculation that the ruling ANC party favoured for many forming a multi-party government of national unity rather than an ANC-DA coalition that is broadly preferred by the markets. And people are asking, and I will ask you, why should investors locally and abroad dictate what coalitions are best for South Africa? Why should they care?
Look, I mean, the one thing that the market is really trying to obviously think about and what it wants is policy certainty. It's policy, certainty in the sense that we need to know what structural reforms need to be implemented. The president at this point in time, if you think about one of the things that he has implemented is Operation Vulindlela. I mean, some of the things there that have happened is that, at this point in time, which is quite an interesting dilemma because, I mean, there's quite a plethora of structural reforms that need to be implemented. And if those things can be implemented, we could see ourselves out of this 1% economic growth, pandemic that we've seen ourselves in over the past couple of years. Already, just from a tracking perspective on that Operation Vulindlela, projects, we've seen that 89% of the renewable and energy projects there are in being completed or close to being completed. We know that we still need to formulate and obviously finish what is happening with the ports and the railway systems. So there's a plethora of issues from a structural reform perspective that obviously the markets want to see being implemented. And I think this is where now it's a case of, we also talk about the amount of corruption and obviously the fruitless and wasteful expenditure that we see in the country. The markets want to see some sort of accountability and responsibility, and also the big implementation that we keep speaking about. We have all these phenomenal policies, but the lack of implementation is obviously hindering the country. And I think at this point in time, the markets want to see the politicians accountable and obviously coming to the party, coming to the table, working together, and also delivering to the people and obviously giving some sort of business confidence and also improving the market sentiment. And I think at that point in time, this is why the market is thinking potentially if you have a coalition somewhat of business-friendly policies and also parties coming to the table where they watch each other. And obviously, at that point in time, if they come to the table and start working together, we could potentially see all these things starting to be delivered. And hopefully, we get ourselves out of this 1% economic growth, because we do know that the country obviously has quite a lot of poverty and unemployment and also inequality. So some of those things really need to be reduced. But at this point in time, it's going to be quite interesting as to whether the ruling party goes to the left or to the right. And nobody knows at this point in time.
Matete Tulare, the head of FX at Rand Merchant Bank. I guess there's still to unpack after tonight's announcement, which is expected from the ANC to tell us what kind of coalition or government of national unity we are likely to live with for the next 5 years. Thank you so much for your time and joining us. And whether you like the markets or not, they will dictate the prices that we pay in the factory floor and in our retail spaces. And it's something to look forward to in terms of how they will respond going forward.